Great. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ellen Herr, and I am a member of the steering committee of Cleveland Park Smart Growth. Welcome to the first installment of Cleveland Park Smart Growth's webinar series on housing. These webinars are intended to provide context, facts, and ideas as we head into this year's upcoming city-led planning process. A reminder that part 2 of this series will be held 4 weeks from tonight on Thursday, February 17th, and will focus on current housing needs in Cleveland Park and the challenges to meeting them. Then on Wednesday, March 16th, the third event will focus on a range of solutions to the housing challenges. Look for more on both of these and how to register in the coming weeks. And now to tonight's program. The commercial areas of Cleveland Park and Woodley Park will be the focus of a design and development analysis led by the DC Office of Planning. That process is slated to kick off this spring and will take up to a year to complete. Currently, both the Cleveland Park and Woodley Park commercial areas are within historic districts, which adds additional complexity to any planning process. The goal of this process is to envision how these two areas can deliver the most housing for a range of incomes in a way that is architecturally compatible with the historic districts and do it through a lens of racial equity. We hope the process will intentionally prioritize goals like affordability, equity, walkability, placemaking, vitality, sustainability, and preservation, which are not always in harmony. And we hope the process will add needed predictability of what's expected and what will be allowed when creating new homes, which will make it more likely that it happens. Cleveland Park benefits from a wide range of public amenities, a metro stop, a beautiful new library, easy access to Rock Creek Park and other green spaces, along with good retail shops, a farmer's market, and other resources. But it is also unaffordable. With detached home sales averaging now over $2 million and average prices of condos nearing $500,000, many people cannot afford to live here, and many who rent here cannot afford to buy. Overwhelmingly white, our neighborhood also falls far short of mirroring our city's racial diversity, a fact that reflects a legacy of deliberate exclusion. So how did Cleveland Park come to be this way? Our first speaker is Cleveland Park Smart Growth's Bob Ward. Bob lives on McCabe Street and became interested in the historical aspects of the neighborhood when he was president of the 100-year-old Cleveland Park Club. He will be reviewing some research he has conducted into the origins of the neighborhood and the exclusionary policies and practices that shaped who is allowed to live here and who is excluded. Next, we will hear from Dr. Brian McCabe. Brian is an associate professor of sociology at Georgetown University. He is the author of No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership, and has also conducted research into the impacts of historic districts on housing. His talk will focus on the twin topics of ensuring all residents and not just the advantaged have a voice in shaping neighborhood change, and how to take a balanced, thoughtful approach to historic preservation that considers both historical context and competing policy priorities. Following these two presentations, Bob and Brian will be joined by Rick Nash, Vice President of the Cleveland Park Historical Society, and Janelle Pagets, Vice Chair of ANC 3C, to discuss and answer questions and comments submitted from the audience. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the icon labeled Q&A. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat for questions. And please remember to be respectful in the chat. Thank you for tuning in to tonight's presentation. And now over to Bob.
Okay. Thank you, Ellen. There we go. So I want to thank everyone for joining tonight. And let me just start by saying that Cleveland Park is an awesome place. And I think its key asset is its people. And so this look back is done from a place of love and admiration for the neighborhood and my neighbors. It's also done by a complete amateur historian who basically has access to the internet and a library card. So keep that in mind. But let's get started. So Cleveland Park was called the queen of the Washington suburbs at the turn of the last century. And we have books and brochures and history about our neighborhood, all kind of recounting this serendipitous evolution into what became a charming village within a city. And Cleveland Park was and is beautiful, as Ellen just said, with lots of great amenities. Yet it is almost entirely white and prohibitively expensive, not only for lower income households, but increasingly for many first-time home buyers and young families. And so what we want to look at is how we got this way. We'll explore some of the history of Cleveland Park, not in the brochures, that made this place a very discriminating queen. Why now? Why are we focused on this subject at this point in time? So for me, there were two things happened over the last couple of years. First was the exposure to Richard Rothstein's work. I saw his video, Segregated by Design, before reading his book, which it's based, The Color of Law. And I was blown away by the intentional actions of the state to deny Black Americans affordable home ownership, and the impact that that systemic racism had on denying generations of Black families from building wealth while white Americans lived the American dream. And of course, in June of 2020, the murder of George Floyd rightfully focused our attention on how state-sanctioned racism is alive and well today, unfortunately, and the need to take more critical anti-racist look at society, our privileges, and how we live our lives. The comprehensive plan discussion over the last several years and its focus on housing, as well as other talks in the area. Historian Neil Flanagan has given some great talks in this vein, as has Matt Fruman and the Washington Interfaith Network. ANC 34G up the road in Chevy Chase has done really great work with their anti-racism task force, as has Historic Chevy Chase and their series on this, where I think Neil and Matt both, or at least Neil spoke at. But it has many of us looking toward our own neighborhoods as we wrestle with these issues. I mean, we can see the privilege of Cleveland Park all around us. And as Ellen said, I started sort of my historical journey when I was over at the Cleveland Park Club, 100 years old this year, and an institution that I absolutely love. But as I was doing that, I would see these ads in the old newspapers about the neighborhood. And I'll show them in just a minute. But having seen that, I started to dig deeper. In the early years, Cleveland Park billed itself openly as restricted and exclusive. The exclusion was nominally economic, not overtly race-based that we know of, but economic exclusion was racial exclusion to an extent. This slide deck, by the way, will live on our website, cpsmartgrowth.com/housing. And I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly so we have lots of time for discussion later. But if you want to pull it up afterwards and go into the details of this, please, I invite you to. So just zooming in on some of these ads and what they were saying, it was clear that the purpose of the exclusivity wasn't just about the architecture and form of the neighborhood. A major selling point was so that buyers would not have to live next to undesirable neighbors who live in inferior houses or shanties. And again, these were purchased advertisements in the newspaper. So how did they do this? How did this exclusion work? The Cleveland Park Company and the Connecticut Avenue Highlands Company maintained their exclusivity through minimum cost restrictions. These would typically restrict unbuilt lots, when the land was subdivided. So you sell a lot, but then there's a restriction on the lot that the property, you couldn't build a house there that cost under a certain amount of money. And these range from $3,500 to $5,000 for building costs. Didn't include the cost of the land. And that was a high sum of money back at the turn of the last century. Beautiful homes at the time, finished homes, and obviously the lots were selling for $6,000, $8,000, $10,000 in the neighborhood at the time. The idea was to preclude lower cost housing to ensure that lower classes and Blacks could not afford to buy here. Also, in a world before zoning, it also barred any non-residential use. So it barred, mercantile establishments. And this example I'm showing you is just a house on the corner of Ross Place and Macomb Street. And it's just an example because these were everywhere. You can see the deed, and it is restricted in both use and in cost. And this was a house that was developed by John Sherman of the Cleveland Park Company. This is a bit of an aside, but I think interesting sort of factoid. In 1915, the Citizens Association at the time passed a resolution that they were very much opposed to businesses coming to Cleveland Park. Especially they had heard rumors that, on Connecticut Avenue between McComb and Newark Street, businesses might show up. And that was a big no-no. Frank Hogan, who, if you're a lawyer, you may be familiar with the law firm Hogan and Hartson. I think it's now Hogan and Levels. It's like top 10 law firm in the world. Frank lived on Ashley Terrace, and he was very much opposed to businesses coming to the area. And I guess the point here I want to make is that was first, the covenants were not just words on paper. These folks knew it, right? And they were looking to the restrictive deeds that barred businesses to being here as the genesis for their outrage and protest against the businesses that were coming here. I think the second thing is just interesting to note that, sometimes the things you protest today are the things you're fighting for tomorrow, like businesses on Connecticut Avenue. Now, the other thing that was found, and this was surprising when I found it because I knew it happened in a lot of places, but I didn't think it happened here, was that there was actually pretty widespread use of racially restrictive covenants in property deeds within Cleveland Park. This house up the street from me on McComb Street was built in 1919 by Harry Kite, who was a prolific developer, not just in Cleveland Park, but in Washington. And it has a specific covenant against selling, renting, or giving the property to, quote, Negroes, colored persons, or people of Negro extraction. And that's hard to see on paper, and it's hard to read, but it was a common practice and became more common in the late teens and early 20s. And so it was so common. There was land on Ordway Street that was owned by the Cleveland Park Congregational Church that was sold by their board of trustees, and in it was a restrictive racial deed. I want to note that the church today is doing amazing work, shining the light on past exclusion. I attended one of their programs recently. I mean, as we talk about these things that happened in the past, they're in the past. And they're doing great work on welcoming more affordable and lower income residents. But this is an example to show that it was so common that the church had one too. So I did some research trying to find, looking through the deeds that I could get access to, and online through DC Recorder of Deeds, you can go back to 1922. And what I found was they weren't everywhere. The cost restrictions were pretty much everywhere, but the racial restrictions were most prolific in George Robinson's what was called Richmond Park. And this includes much of Rodman, Quebec, Porter, and Ordway, and on both sides of Reno Road. It was also used in the later developments that Harry Kite put in on McComb Street between Ross Place and 33rd Place. More research is needed in this area to get the measure of the full extent of the racial covenants were used in this area, as well as mapping the minimum price covenants in area deeds, as I said, which was prolific. There's a group in DC, Prologue DC, has a project called Mapping Segregation, and they've been doing awesome work doing this. When I first looked, I figured there weren't racial covenants in Cleveland Park because there was no markers on their map. What I found is that their work is very much a work in progress. I've shared my research with them, and they are in need of volunteers. So it's mappingsegregationdc.org. I invite you to look them up. It's really good work. You may not recognize the faces, but the names are probably familiar to most in the area. William and Allison Miller were brothers who were real estate developers. They grew up on this house on Highland Place, got into the real estate business. They built homes in Cleveland Park, several on 34th Street with racially restrictive covenants. They went on to build whole neighborhoods, all with racial restrictions like this one in Wesley Heights, which excluded not only Blacks, but Jews as well. And even after the Supreme Court ruling making racial covenants unenforceable, which was in 1948, the Miller brothers were still including these restrictions in new neighborhoods like in Spring Valley. It wasn't just the single family homes. This ad from the newly built Kennedy Warren in the late 1920s promoted its exclusivity, saying it would look for tenants to maintain the character of their property. They didn't want riffraff. So these policies and practices were in place. The 1940 census, which is the latest one in which we can actually go block by block, house by house, and look who lived in the neighborhood and some basic characteristics of them. The only African-American, and I did that, there's like 3 different enumeration districts that compose this area, and I went through every one of them. The only African-Americans living in Cleveland Park homes were servants, like Marion Dorsey, who worked for the Jensen family living at 3315 Ross Place. There were many throughout the neighborhood, but they were there as employment and not as owners or renters or lodgers. This was also true in our apartment buildings. So the only African-Americans living in apartment buildings were staff, like this building at the corner of Connecticut Macomb, the Parkway. Arthur and Gertrude Wright, who worked as a janitor and maid at the Parkway. They were a couple, lived in one of the apartments there. And that was common in many of the apartments, that the only Blacks who were in the area were here because of the job they were doing. So you didn't have an African-American who was like a government clerk living in one of the apartments here. That was not found in any one of our buildings in 1940. So in 1940, in a city with 29% Black population, Precinct 8, which is a rough approximation of today's Ward 3, and includes Cleveland Woodley Park, was 3% Black. And so these were pretty much all domestic servants who were accounted for in the census. So the accumulated effect of these policies and practices, you have to say, was incredibly effective. I love this one. So as you know, we've got these cute apartment buildings on our side streets. They're on Macomb, there's many on Porter, there's one in Rodman, 29th Street. So yes, we have apartments on our avenues, but we also have these apartments on our side streets. And then we don't. Like they stopped happening. And I had to assume that at some point there was a decision made to stop that happening. And I found it. And it was in 1923. So all of these buildings were built in the early 20s. If they were built after 1923, they were probably permitted before the zoning change. But at the request of the Cleveland Park and the Connecticut Avenue Citizens Associations, the zoning code was changed to make it illegal for any more apartments to be built on our side streets. And so it thus stopped more affordable housing types in our neighborhood from being built. What was fascinating, and the article is on our housing webpage. You can link to it and read the whole article. It's really interesting stuff. But the arguments for banning apartments were that they were houses of immorality. And the developers argued that, they were not houses of immorality, that good people lived in apartments and they provided affordable housing for lower paid government workers. But the citizens associations of the day won, and the zoning commission outlawed the building of these apartments on our side streets. But even today, I mean, these modest buildings that survive contribute to our neighborhood, providing housing that is more affordable than single family homes. So next look, also in the 1940s, there were some lower priced housing to be found in addition to the apartment buildings, and that was boarders, lodgers. And it was all over the neighborhood. So as you go through house by house, you see people like this house on Macomb Street, where you have an older couple that are, living in the house, and then they're joined by 3 lodgers, all unrelated, all white. All the lodgers in Cleveland Park were white. But this map where I plotted where I found them on the enumeration sheets show that they were pretty much all over the neighborhood. The exclusion that happened during this period was not only running with the individual properties or the new zoning code. Everyone is familiar probably with redlining, but the federal government actively participated in segregation through this process of grading neighborhoods for mortgage risk purposes. Neighborhoods that were white and likely to stay that way through protections were given better risk scores, while Negro developments in white areas that may convert to Negro neighborhoods were scored lower, which meant loans were far more expensive. And you can see here on this map that Cleveland Park was graded B1 near the top of the scoring. I think Woodley Park was graded A, but all at the high end. It wasn't just the federal government, institutions, the Board of Trade, the Board of Realtors, the citizens associations of the day were all involved in perpetuating segregation, and not in subtle ways. So, the Washington Real Estate Board Code of Ethics: no property in a white section should be ever sold, rented, or advertised or offered to colored people. This was 1948. So there was, it was a thing, unfortunately, and it didn't apply only to housing. Right? The schools were segregated in Washington, D.C. I mean, before 1954, you had obviously Brown versus the Board of Education, which applied to the states. And you had Bowling versus Sharp, which applied to D.C., that desegregated public education. John Eaton was a white school up until 1954. This piece here that you're seeing on the screen comes from their centennial history, which the school and the kids put together. So, I mean, like, kudos for them to, reporting on this history, because I think it's important for people to know. There was absolutely a shift in the mores. I mean, we obviously know that, but when did it happen? Between this, pro-segregationist view and a more liberal view of civil rights and justice. And we see that the Citizens Association here in Cleveland Park got rid of their racial restrictions in 1962. But an interesting article that I found from Carl Bernstein, of all people, written in 1969, talks about an earlier transition from what they call the old, Taft era founders of the neighborhood to the New Dealers who came in and were asked to sign racially restrictive covenants and refused to. It's a great article. It is also linked on our website, so go read the whole article. It's fascinating. Bernstein notes, without any irony, that these new liberals that were coming to our neighborhood in the time, they rally around the flag to fight off high-rise developers. And then in the next statement says, in a generation after the New Dealers refused to sign racially restrictive covenants, there were only a handful more Negroes living in Cleveland Park than when FDR was president. I don't think he connected those two dots, but it clearly was that somewhere mid-century, the mores of society shifted here, as we obviously know they did. Next slide, there we go. And then just, even with the legal restrictions gone up through the 1980s, Cleveland Park remained overwhelmingly white as it is today. And while very much an attractive neighborhood, it was at the time not as out of reach price-wise as it is today. When the Red Line Metro opened in the early 1980s, mixed-use density at our Metro stops were considered. Something our business owners at the time had hoped for, but that came to a crashing halt when the proposed development at the Park and Shop, which was to offer mixed use, underground parking, 20% low income housing. Despite the protests of the area businesses, the historic district was designated in 1986 to include the commercial area. You look at the nomination form that created the historic district, and one of the criteria of creating the district talks about its founding by an enlightened and benevolent real estate developer. If I probably read that 2 years ago, I don't think it would have impacted me at all. I wouldn't have thought twice about that. But I think given the context of what we've reviewed here tonight, I mean, perhaps that view deserves maybe some revision. I mean, in nowhere in the nomination will you find mention of the intentional exclusion and racism that was woven into the cloth of the early neighborhood. And so, I mean, I just think it's something that might be addressed. And I'm wrapping up because I want to get to Brian and I want to have a really good time for discussion. Why does this matter? So what? It was then, it's not now. I think what this look back shows is that from the beginning, the area, Cleveland and Woodley Park, were by no means alone, was created to exclude lower classes and specifically Blacks, and it was highly successful. Those practices of exclusion occurred during the period of significance of our historic district, meaning we are largely physically unchanged from the time when those policies were in full force. And while the racial policies have absolutely changed, the barriers to physical change, primarily zoning, and now with the overlay of the historic preservation, they exist. And the conditions here, I mean, they're getting worse, not better. And we'll get into this in part 2 in our discussion in February. But our realtor, Casey Abalafia, reported at the February ANC meeting, the average sale price for detached homes in Cleveland Park over the last 10 years rose from 1.3 million to $2 million. And as of the 2020 census, the immediate area is 5% Black, while the city overall is 49% Black. So economic exclusion is a real thing, and it is getting worse. What are my takeaways? And I want to hear other people's takeaways too, and I hope we get to that in our discussion. But here are my takeaways. Number one, I think we need to accept that the early 20th century DC was really flawed. And the built environment of our area is a product of extremely unjust policies. Our founders were neither enlightened nor benevolent. And at minimum, I think we need to work to change that narrative and stop celebrating the product of that exclusion. 2 and 3 are kind of related. I mean, as we'll see in part 2 of this series, it is becoming increasingly difficult for many to live and start families here, let alone opening doors to the most severely housing challenged. It's not racism, but it has a racial impact. And at present, I mean, we really can't change anything, right? We can't easily build up. We can't add gentle density to our side streets. We've somewhat handcuffed ourselves. And so point 4 is, I hope that during our upcoming planning process, we think about how we can support change that opens doors to more people from a range of backgrounds and incomes, and that going forward, we be open to ideas that allow more creative changes to happen. Remember, the thing we protest against today may very well be the thing that we'll be fighting to keep tomorrow. Thank you, and I think we're turn it over to Brian.
Great, thanks, Bob. Let me go ahead and share my screen as well. Okay. Okay, hopefully, oops, sorry, let me do one more thing. Okay. Hopefully folks can see that. Bob, you can see that all right?
Yep, I can see it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to be here. I want to start by sharing just a little bit about sort of who I am and my research and sort of why I think it links up to the work that you all are doing. And I'll just say before I start, it's a particular pleasure to get invited to be part of a group so close to Georgetown and in the Washington, D.C. community, and to do, to think that the work that we're doing on campus and the research that we're doing helps to inform conversations that are happening elsewhere in the city. So thank you for the invitation to speak. So as Bob mentioned, I'm an associate professor of sociology at Georgetown and an affiliated faculty member in the McCourt School of Public Policy. I do work on a number of urban policy issues, including work on evictions and housing insecurity here in DC, along with my colleague Eva Rosen. I published a report a year ago that looks at the geography of evictions, racial geography of evictions here in the district. I do work on housing affordability, including housing vouchers and homeownership issues, on historic preservation that I'll talk about today, and on municipal campaign finance issues. And so for me, where this sort of all comes together and where I think it sort of speaks to the conversation that you're having as a community, is that I'm really interested in understanding how social policy and how public policy contribute to patterns of social inequality in the city. In some instances, it's creating new patterns of inequality. And in some instances, and I think it builds nicely off of what Bob has shared, it's reinforcing existing patterns of inequality in the city. And so that's sort of where I come from, thinking about what I want to share today. So the talk that I put together, and I'll just spend maybe 15 minutes or so on some of my work and kind of related issues that I think will raise issues for a conversation. I want to talk a bit about home ownership and then a bit about historic preservation, and then thinking about how they come together to recreate sort of exclusionary neighborhoods. So my first book is a book that's actually about home ownership. On the right-hand side here, the book is called No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership. And what I try to do in the book is to think about the civic engagement of homeowners and renters, and to understand sort of how homeowners become involved in their communities, why they become involved in their communities, and what types of activities, right, they become involved in when they join when they join community groups or participate in community activities. And so in the book, I look across a range of measures that we use as social scientists to define civic engagement. So things like writing a letter to a legislator, voting in a local election, attending a town meeting, joining a community group, sort of all these types of things that we think of as elements of good citizenship, as ways to engage in the political process. And across nearly all of these factors, right, I sort of report that homeowners are engaged at higher rates than renters, right? So homeowners are more involved in their communities than renters. This is probably not surprising to anybody on the webinar, right? Not only because of home ownership, but because homeowners tend to be sort of a number of other things, right? Tend to be older, tend to be wealthier, tend to have higher levels of education, and all of these things are correlated with participation in communities. But even when we sort of net out those things, right, we compare kind of equal, similar people who are homeowners and renters, homeowners do tend to engage more. And so one of the things that I want to do in the book that I think is really relevant to this conversation is to think about sort of the degree to which this engagement is driven by residential stability, and the degree that it's driven by financial investments. And let me say just a bit more about kind of what I mean there. So for residential stability, right, we're thinking about how long people have lived in a neighborhood. And one of the sort of core findings from the book is that a lot of this engagement is actually driven by residential stability, right? It's not necessarily the fact that folks own their homes, but actually it's that homeowners tend to be in a neighborhood for much longer, right? On average, they tend to be in neighborhoods longer than renters are. And so being stable, being a sort of long-term resident of a community might drive political engagement by deepening the kinds of attachments that people have to a place. It increases the knowledge of the political process, like maybe simple things like where to vote or where the ANC meets. It increases social connections that might drive people to politics. And it generates a sort of sense of stewardship over the community. So in this way, right, we might actually expect that long-term renters, right, people that are renters but have lived in the community for a long time, we might expect them to actually to behave like homeowners when they approach civic and political engagement. So that's sort of one side of the coin when I think about the politics of homeownership. But the other is about the financial investments that homeowners make, right? We know that housing is the biggest wealth investment that most homeowners have. Right, people hold more wealth in their housing than they do in any other investment. It's one of the reasons why a lot of our policies, a lot of our federal policies, are geared at promoting home ownership for low and middle income families, right? Because that the wealth built through home ownership enables people to, weather emergencies, weather health emergencies, save for retirement, send their kids to college, right? All of these things. So the sort of other side of this coin is that the financial investments that homeowners make in their homes is one of the reasons that they engage in community affairs, right? They're working to protect the largest investment that they have, right? From changes in the neighborhood that they perceive might lead to a decline in home value, right? So this kind of political involvement often centers on reducing uncertainty, right? Sort of keeping the neighborhood as it is, rejecting things that we think might be undesirable land uses. And there are lots of sort of discussions across DC of this, things like where we would cite homeless shelters or other land uses that people would recognize as necessary for functioning of the city, but often don't want in their communities, or curbing affordable housing development. And I think that this is where this is sort of playing out quite often here in DC. There's a whole bunch of research on this, and particularly looking at kind of the reasons and the ways that homeowners get involved in their communities, including a new book called Neighborhood Defenders by a political scientist actually at Boston University named Catherine Einstein, showing sort of how homeowners get involved in neighborhood affordable housing developments, often to stall, to slow, or to stop new housing development altogether in their communities. So one of the central things that I raise in the book, though, is this question about what I call the politics of exclusion. And I think it's important because as social scientists and I think as citizens, we tend to think that all civic engagement is good, right? In other words, the more that we're involved in local politics, the stronger our communities will be, right? The more people attend meetings, the more they vote in local elections, the more they're in contact with their legislators. Like civic engagement is typically thought of as sort of an all-in positive good. But I think we have to keep in mind too that people have different ways that they participate and different levels of time, resources, and ability to participate in civic life. And in fact, one of the things I often share with my students, one of the the most robust social science findings in this realm is that the people that participate the most in civic and political life, right? They're people that have the time to do so, the money to do so, and the social networks of people asking them to do so, right? In other words, we get involved in politics when we have, or community life, when we have the resources to do so, and when our friends ask us to, and that is very stratified, right? By race and by class and by home ownership status. So, but the idea of the politics of exclusion suggests that homeowners are often engaging in exclusionary tactics when they get involved in civic life, right? And I sort of highlight like 3 ways to think about people doing this. So one is by reshaping the common good to revolve around their own interests as homeowners, right? So what's good for homeowners is good for the neighborhood, right? And so that effort to sort of link up the things that might benefit homeowners, like financially benefit homeowners, and reframe those as if they are the common good, right? So equating homeowners with the community or the neighborhood. A second thing that's often done that I show in the book is showing how homeowners highlight their status as taxpayers, right, to stake their claims in public debates. So often saying, well, as a homeowning citizen, I pay property taxes or whatever it is, right, when in fact everybody, renters pay taxes too, right? They'll pay taxes, their landlords are paying taxes, but their rents are paying those. So sort of everybody's a taxpayer, but there's this effort to sort of stake a claim to being taxpayers. And then finally, an effort, I think, to prioritize the status of being homeowner over the status of being renter to legitimize claims to political involvement. But one thing I think that's important in this conversation is that research actually suggests that there aren't really property value impacts from the construction of affordable housing, right? Which is to say that simply the construction of affordable housing in neighborhoods doesn't necessarily drive property values down. And I know you're going to have conversations about this moving forward, but this largely reflects the fact that most of our affordable housing today is done with 2 things in mind. Number one, almost all of our affordable housing construction is in mixed income buildings. So sort of, they're not public housing developments that we've historically built. They tend to be buildings that, sort of fit into the landscape that have some affordable units in them. And by and large, what we're calling affordable units are actually units that are very much available to middle class families in the city. We have a measure of the area median income. And most affordable housing today is built for families making about 60 or 80% of the area median income. In DC, that's somewhere about $70,000 or $80,000, right? So they're below the kind of area average, but they're very middle income families in most of our affordable housing developments. And with this, I think also there's some discussions about density and thinking about how dense housing and dense affordable housing both helps to maintain commercial establishments. It's something that we've seen a lot, especially in the last couple of years as businesses have closed because of COVID, and thinking about how it is that these dense developments help to kind of distribute the responsibility for affordable housing production across neighborhoods in the city. So just to sort of summarize the work that I've done on homeownership and sort of where I think it touches on the debates you're having, I think it's worth sort of recognizing how ownership shapes kind of social and political behavior of people in neighborhoods, thinking about how we can affirm the rights of renters to also engage as community members in community politics and be engaged in shaping neighborhoods, and to recognize how very understandable efforts to protect assets, protect housing wealth, might actually create and reinforce patterns of social exclusion, often driven by a false sense of neighborhood change. So I want to sort of step forward to another set of research, and then I'll kind of bring it all together. One other sort of hat that I wear as a researcher at Georgetown is about thinking about the impact of historic preservation. And on the right, I've just put a paper from a couple of years ago asking whether or not preservation accelerates neighborhood change. Essentially, the question we were trying to get at in this paper was whether historic preservation in New York leads to gentrification, right? Is it a process that actually accelerates this process of gentrification? And I'll say I'm happy to talk about kind of New York, DC comparisons and where it might make sense and where it might not. But I'll just lead by saying, right, critics of the historic preservation process often argue that preservation leads to gentrification for three reasons. Number one, that it limits the supply of housing. Number two, and related to that, it increases property values. And number three, historic neighborhoods tend to attract higher income residents who value historic amenities, right? So to just go through that, right? Preservation obviously limits the kind of housing or the type of housing that can be built in a community or where that housing can be built. In this way, we might think of preservation as kind of a light form of zoning by limiting or restricting the kind of development that can occur in neighborhoods. By restricting the supply of housing, and in doing so, increasing the desirability of a neighborhood, right? Preservation can also increase property values in that community. We also find that nearby communities also experience an appreciation in property values from this preservation process. And that preservation may attract residents, including those with higher incomes or higher level of education, who value historic amenities, right? Who want to live in the kinds of neighborhoods that are protected and preserved through the historic preservation process. So you can imagine, right, that the preservation process, by limiting the amount of new housing that can be built in a place, by effectively increasing property values and attracting high income residents, right, recreates sort of certain patterns, certain demographic patterns in those neighborhoods. In New York City, what we find, and again, I can't speak kind of empirically to what's going on in Washington, D.C., but I can, happy to talk through sort of some of the reasons why we might expect or not expect similar things in the district. Our research shows that after neighborhoods are designated as a historic district, that the share of Black residents in a neighborhood declines, that the poverty rate goes, the poverty rate goes down, right? There are fewer poor residents in the neighborhood, the median income goes up, and the share of college educated residents goes up, right? So after the designation of these districts, we start to see demographic changes that suggest that they're more exclusive, that they're wealthier, that they're whiter, that they're attracting higher SES households. So to the degree that neighborhoods become less affordable or more exclusive, right, following the designation of a district, right, we argue that they're contributing to these patterns of segregation and to marginalization. And, I want to point out, and I think that this is one of the things that we think about in doing policy, that, these are secondary consequences and probably unexpected consequences of what are otherwise sort of very well-meaning and very important efforts to protect the historical character of a community and preserve buildings and architectural significance. That of course is the sort of primary goal of historic preservation efforts. But these patterns, these preservation efforts often contribute to racial segregation and to kind of further marginalization by making communities more expensive and making communities less accessible to people of color. I think this is especially true when patterns of historic preservation, right, map onto existing patterns of segregation. Right, which is to say that neighborhoods that are receiving historic preservation may be neighborhoods that are already wealthier, where for a long time the housing stock has been preserved, and therefore when they go to be designated as neighborhoods, right, there's an existing historic housing stock that merits designation. So just an opportunity to sort of think about how the primary goal of historic preservation and protecting buildings and communities of architectural significance may have a secondary effect of recreating or reinforcing these patterns of exclusion and marginalization. So, I'll just wrap up by saying that a lot of my own work is actually thinking about kind of this very puzzle, right? Both emphasizing an acknowledgement of what the intended effects of social policy are. So what's the intention of programs that are designed to promote homeownership? What's the intention of ways of programs that are designed to promote historic preservation? But also, what are the sort of secondary effects of these programs, the unexpected consequences of these programs? And as Bob mentioned, and I just looked up right before I jumped on, Cleveland Park is among the whitest, wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, right? Compared to more than 46% of residents in DC are African American, only about 5% in Cleveland Park. 74% of residents in Cleveland Park are white, compared to about 42 or 43% in the city as a whole. And the average family income is, of an order of magnitude higher than the average income in DC. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but happy to sort of talk more through these issues and sort of how I understand them relating to the work that you all are doing.
Thank you, Brian.
Great. Okay, so we've had our presentations. Now we're going to start the Q&A portion. So panelists are going to be, of course, Bob and Dr. McCabe, and then joining us we have Rick Nash and Janelle Pagets. And let's see, we have 2 questions so far from our audience. The first question is there a way to preserve historic character of a neighborhood without contributing to the segregation and marginalization of anyone? So I don't know who wants to try to field that, whether maybe Dr. McCabe, that might be a question for you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard question. I think that I guess where I would start is in some of our work on New York, one of the things that we recommend is that when historic districts are designated in New York, that there should be essentially a study done of the number of housing units that are lost in that neighborhood, or the number of potential housing units that are lost in that neighborhood as a result of historic preservation, right? So my interest and my effort is sort of never to cut off preservation altogether. I really see a lot of value and a lot of importance in historic preservation, but the trade-off is when you limit density because of preservation, when you limit opportunities to redevelop, those are units that could have been built that will not be built because of that, right? And so one of the things that we sort of recommend that the city does is to think about how many potential units might be lost as a result of them, and how that number of units could otherwise be included in a similar kind of neighborhood, or similar, a neighborhood of sort of similar opportunity, right? Because what we don't want to happen is sort of those units to just be built in poor neighborhoods or low opportunity neighborhoods because of the designation process. The other piece of it, I think that this, there are a lot of kind of moving pieces together. The other piece of it is, I think, raising awareness and working with landlords to think about how it is that families that have vouchers could move into neighborhoods like Cleveland Park. So the voucher program is a program where a family pays a portion of their rent, and the housing authority through the voucher pays the rest of the rent. And DC has a particular system. It's called the small area fair market rent system. The details don't really matter, but what does matter is that a voucher holder is able to find a housing unit in any neighborhood. So even though Cleveland Park is an expensive neighborhood, there's a set of units in a neighborhood like Cleveland Park that would be available to voucher holders, right? But we know in DC there's a lot of discrimination against people that have housing vouchers. And so I think sort of the more that we can work not only to build affordable housing, but to create opportunities for people with vouchers, right, to find housing in neighborhoods like Cleveland Park, the more that, the better off we are. But this is, it's a difficult question because all these pieces go hand in hand, right? We need to build affordable housing and ensure that voucher tenants have access to high opportunity neighborhoods, and preserve and protect the kind of architectural significance of a neighborhood. And so it only works, I think, if we're working on the other pieces at the same time.
Great. I think we have another question that sort of
Ellen?
ties in. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Bob, whatever.
I mean, if I got the question right, I mean, I think one of the things
Yeah.
you can think about is, we have this dual regulatory framework over a historic district, and I think the question was, how do you keep the character but allow more housing? Was that what it was? Um,
Yeah,
so
preserve historic character, but still do, housing. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things, an area like ours could consider are things that are done in other areas of the city where you have different building types, but I think the concept is similar, which are like home conversions. I lived on a street in DuPont Circle where, each of the row houses, on the street that we lived on, had, probably 3 condos in them apiece. There are some large standalone houses in Mount Pleasant that are divided up similarly. That's prevented by zoning, not by historic preservation. And that is something that, could be part of a discussion. If 2 families, 3 families living on a lot instead of 1, you've increased the housing. They're probably all, not going to be capital A affordable housing, but they'll probably all be a lot cheaper than a single family home would be. So that's one small piece of how that question might be answered.
Yeah, and then, there was a similar question in the Q&A. If most affordable housing is built for those earning 60 to 80% of FMI, which I guess is like fair market value, what is to be done for
Family
those
median income?
Oh, median income. What is to be done for those earning 0 to 50%? So the lower end of, low income. Is there a way to really prioritize, even lower income than we generally do with our housing?
Right. Well, I mean, I can share a bit about my understanding of this. So most of the, all the affordable housing that's built, it's built with low-income housing tax credits or other kinds of mostly federal, but sometimes local subsidies as well, right? So in other words, the federal or local government provides subsidy to developers, and in exchange, the developers provide a certain number of units, apartment units that are available for lower moderate income families. And so most of the units are built at 60 to 80% of AMI, and largely because that's how the math best works out for the development community. My understanding is that for much lower than that, there's you'd have to have extremely deep subsidies to actually build apartment units that would be affordable for a family making 20 or 30% of AMI, right? And so in the production side, we don't really have a lot of programs that are doing production at that low level of AMI. Really, the answer is the voucher program, right? So to get a voucher across the country, but to get a voucher in Washington, D.C., 75% of all the vouchers that are given out are to families at or below 30% of AMI. So the lowest income families are the ones that are getting a voucher, and they're renting a unit on the private market, right? Any sort of private market unit, like the rental unit that I live in, right? And so I think that we need to sort of think about, there are 2 ways to think about it, right? There's kind of like moderate middle income families, and those are largely production subsidies to build new housing in a neighborhood like Cleveland Park. And then there are vouchers, and vouchers are going to the poorest families to go find housing sort of anywhere in the city. And then the opportunity is to, how do we make a low-income family, maybe a low-income family that's never been to Cleveland Park, right? Doesn't really know what Cleveland Park is, like doesn't know the great schools that are in Cleveland Park or the transit that they have access to. How do we help a family who's getting a voucher, right? And they have to go out and look for housing. How do we encourage them to think of a neighborhood like Cleveland Park and ask themselves, would this be a good neighborhood for me to live in? Is it close to work? Is it accessible to schools that I want to be part of? And so part of that is the responsibility, I think, of the housing authority and sort of accompanying organizations to make sure that when voucher tenants get a voucher, they don't always just go back to the neighborhood that they came from, right? Quite often that might be the best choice for them, and that's great, right? Everybody should be able to kind of make the housing choice that's best for them. But we know from a lot of research that people that get vouchers often don't think of neighborhoods like Cleveland Park, right? They don't think of white, wealthy neighborhoods as places that they might live because, in their sort of mental maps of DC, like this is not a neighborhood that they often go to, that they have friends and family in, that their church is in, that they know the schools, right? So it's not the kind of neighborhood that they might think of, even though there's a lot of opportunity available in Cleveland Park, right, to send your kids to good schools and to be really accessible to the rest of the city and things like that. So so I would just sort of make the divide that like the kind of moderate middle income is much more production subsidies, and the lowest income is much more through housing vouchers or rental assistance given to tenants.
Mhm.
Yeah. Could I jump in?
Sure, sure, no problem.
First of all, I'm Rick Nash, and I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion on behalf of Historic Cleveland Park, or the Cleveland Park Historical Society. And first of all, I think it's important, we often kind of think of Cleveland Park in a sort of monolithic sense that, there's the historic district, which defines the whole neighborhood. But, while the historic district comprises a lot of Cleveland Park, including some blocks along Connecticut Avenue. When you think of the neighborhood as being bounded by Woodley Park to the south, Rock Creek Park to the east, Wisconsin Avenue to the west, and, roughly Sidwell Friends School to the north, it includes areas both within and outside the historic district. And then, of course, other boundaries get a little more fuzzy because there are, other areas in proximity to the Cleveland Park neighborhood itself. But there's also this notion that the historic district is frozen in amber. The change is impossible. And in fact, it is. And, the Historical Society supports thoughtful growth, including infill development that's sensible and compatible with the historic context. And if you look today, in the historic district right now, there's like 4 or 5 infill projects that either are under construction, that have been permitted or are close to getting permits or approvals, ranging from, Connecticut Avenue to up Newark Street, partway up the hill, a new apartment building, to a new apartment building on McCabe Street, and so forth. And then, just within I'd say 100 yards or 200 yards of the historic district, there's an additional 1,500 units coming online at City Ridge and the adjacent property. And then, even within the center of Cleveland Park itself, there is property available that is zoned for higher density, that is matter of right development, that is not subject to historic restrictions, including, large surface parking lots, in other areas. So there's a lot of opportunity both within the historic district and immediately outside the historic district in Cleveland Park and in the environs to add a lot of density. The other point that I'd like to address is what I think is a false dichotomy between historic preservation on the one hand and affordable housing, which I think is the ultimate goal, which certainly CPHS also shares. To have truly affordable housing in DC and Ward 3 and in Cleveland Park in particular. But, creating affordable housing and retaining historic and environmental character are not competing goals. And there is, obviously literature that suggests that they're antithetical. But there's also literature, as well as research conducted by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, that finds that historic preservation can be a very effective means of preserving particularly, smaller buildings, and mixed age blocks that tend to provide a lot of affordable housing. And, when you combine historic preservation tax credits with other incentives, you can even expand or rehabilitate the stock of affordable housing in those buildings. And also research has shown that historic districts actually act as a sort of way to smooth speculative increases in property prices, and may actually keep prices lower by subjecting otherwise matter of right development to historic review. And why are these buildings important? Well, because, as I said, they do contain existing stock of affordable housing, including rent controlled housing, which, today is under threat in Ward 3 in Cleveland Park. There was data from the Urban Institute, I think a couple of years ago, that showed that Ward 3 has the second highest number of rent-controlled units in DC after Ward 1. And that total may have come down because, as properties are redeveloped, with perhaps some of the additional incentives provided now by the comprehensive plan and FLUM, those are lost. And I fully agree with Professor McCabe that vouchers are a very important part of expanding truly affordable housing, including in higher opportunities like Ward 3. But even in DC, the voucher program has the pernicious side effect of taking a rent-controlled unit out of the stock of rent-controlled housing, and resetting it to market prices, including once the voucher holder leaves. And I think the challenge is illustrated, frankly, by an infill project just north of the post office in Cleveland Park, where it was a 12-unit multifamily building, all rent controlled, which is being rehabilitated with 2 floors being added on, so additional height in the historic district. It expanded to 18 units, but with 2 inclusionary zoning units. So, one step forward with 2 IZ units, but the loss of 12 rent-controlled units. So I think DC has to have a very concerted, consistent policy that, one, looks for new opportunities for affordable housing, with inclusionary zoning, as imperfect as it is, being part of the toolkit. Looks, first of all, to acknowledge, but to protect the existing stock of affordable and rent-controlled housing that exists in our area. And then, includes and increases the voucher program, but then finally really puts skin in the game to come up with true affordable housing, well below the 80 and 60% AMIs that exist. And that's going to require, city investments like, the Bowser administration passed on purchasing the Wardman Marriott, which they could have done for affordable housing. They did use city-owned land to build the Ward 3 homeless shelter on the west side of Cleveland Park, which made sense. But they could use land, at UDC to provide transit accessible, deeply affordable housing. And finally, they could partner with faith-based institutions that may have property, and together with a city and a private developer could create truly affordable workplace housing, by 501c3s that will accept a social, market rate of return consistent with their mission. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We have another question here. Someone wants to know about how they can remove, the racial covenant from their deed. She had read the Richard Rothstein book and advocates for modifying them rather than removing them to acknowledge and condemn our country's racist history. In either case, it can be expensive and or difficult to do so. Are there any resources available to help DC residents make these changes, especially at minimal to no cost? I don't know if anybody on the panel is aware of resources that could be helpful in removing racial covenants.
I don't have any answers to that question. I would, just because I think they know a lot about this, and I'm not sure they know the answer to this question, I would point them to the Mapping Segregation folks, Prologue DC. It's mappingsegregationdc.org. And I'm not sure if
Maybe we can put that.
Sarah Schoenfeld was
in the
registered.
chat.
I'm not sure if she's here, but that's something that we can look into as well and post on our website.
Yeah.
And find out, but I don't know what that they were on the deeds in the past. Are they still on the deeds now? I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a great idea and an opportunity maybe for, say, a student law clinic, focused on real estate law,
Mhm.
partner with an organization like that and remove covenants.
Definitely. We also have a question about, how can we make Ward 3 racial inclusivity appealing to real estate developers? And whether anybody has thoughts on that. We also have a question about how can we get developers interested in building duplexes and triplexes, assuming zoning laws allow it. I fear the costs are just so high, even with favorable zoning. So,
David Christile, are you?
yes.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say to that first question about how do you make it attractive to developers to build more racially inclusive? I mean, why don't you tackle that? Because I think there are a bunch of affordable housing developers who'd love to work here, and there are barriers.
Right, and there's a number of hats. I'll wear the first hat that Brian talked about, and it's really it's a math problem, and as long as there are resources that the city has, and they have their housing production trust fund, which does finance affordable housing developments that go below the 60% level. And part of that is really advocacy on the budget to make sure that trust fund is funded and funded more. And the second part, you talked about the voucher program, which is again it's a federal program, and that needs a lot more funding. But I think it's, in terms of getting developers here, there's the resources, and if they have the resources, then it's what do we do as a community to encourage this type of development. And when I put on my ANC hat with my colleagues at ANC 3F, we really have been bullish on wanting housing where it's appropriate along Connecticut Avenue, and then talking to developers about the sites that may be available. One example is roadside development has the property between the Potbelly and the Wells Fargo on Connecticut Avenue, and they're going to they want to do development there. And we've certainly told them that when they come to the community, that they're going to have, not unconditional support, but they've got support from us to do what the updated land use plan says, and that's additional density. And as others have talked about, we want not just the inclusionary zoning units that would come from that, but we want units that have the other resources that are financed through the tax credit program, through the trust fund, production trust fund, so that it's not just ISA units, but it's actually more affordable units. I think Mr. Nash, you mentioned the there's historic tax credits that also can finance housing that could also be affordable. But I think it's the willingness of the community and people to speak out and say, hey, we want this, we need this housing, we need it for our workforce, we need it for people that work here but don't live here, we need it for school teachers, we need it for some of us that have older kids that want to come back and live in the neighborhood, we want it for them as well. So there's a whole range of tools and possibilities, but I think part of it is how do we as a community voice that support for that kind of housing? And that's also kind of a segue into what's going to happen in parts 2 and 3 of this series. So thanks.
Great. Yeah, we've had similar questions. Going back to what Bob was saying about how there was an effort to stop the building of some of these smaller apartment buildings on the side streets. Is there a way that we could efforts since then to change the zoning laws back to allow those kinds of smaller apartment buildings? But I think, like you said, David, that's sort of what we're going to be talking about, in our next presentation, so people can, tune into those. Yeah, let's see. Let's go to the. Janelle, yeah, you wanted to.
I can tie a few of these things together.
Yeah, sure.
With what Professor McCabe brought up with looking at the amount of housing lost by some of the zoning rules, the historic district rules. The zoning and the historic district and the future land use map, they don't correspond to one another, right? So let's look at the case of the Macklin project and what happened there and how many units were taken out of that in incremental ways by different rules being applied. So the Macklin project is in Cleveland Park, right at the corner of Connecticut and Newark Street. With the custom zoning involved, even though the future land use map and the comp plan say that it could be bigger, the historic district knocks it down a bit. So we're taking, after that first cut, 27 units off of what could have potentially been 66 units. So there you go. Then there was a preemptive concession that knocked down another 41 unit, or brought the total down another bunch of units, and now we're at 41 units lost. And then when it went into HPRB review, lost another unit based on their comments. And all of these reviews and all of these processes cost time, money. That's also, you know, weighing in on property owners, the developers, bottom lines, right? And that's taking some affordable units out. Now we can talk about like the vouchers and the AMI and all of that percentage and how that works out. But if we're not building the housing units, like the units aren't there to apply any of these things to, like it has to be built. And we're losing a lot of potential with some of these things, right? So.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Another question is, you know, wondering how increasing density will lead to more economic diversity. You know, it seems that, you know, they say that, you know, some stuff that does get built does not contribute to any increase in racial diversity. And the strategies for ensuring access and diversity are not part of the vision of developers in this neighborhood. So is there, you know, other ways, or is it just that more dense, you know, we need even more density than we're already building, and that will start to, you know, lead to more economic diversity? I don't know who wants to field that.
I'll sort of field it by raising a question, which is, if, you know, we continue to rely on inclusionary zoning in market rate development in order to provide affordable housing and increase economic, racial, and social diversity, I guess the question is, if you could theoretically wish away the historic district, what makes anyone think that you'd get any different result than what we're seeing today? You know, if again you look at two major developments under construction, you know, on the northwest side of Cleveland Park, it's City Ridge, and I think the other at 4,000 Wisconsin is called Upton Place. You know, 1,500 housing units, and under IZ rules, 8%. Okay, these are expensive, amenity-laden, marketed as luxury buildings. A different example is 5333 Connecticut Avenue, not in Cleveland Park, but just up the road in Chevy Chase. You know, 10-story matter of right building, less than 8% IZ if the math is correct. Again, luxury building. You know, these are matter of right, relatively easy. I'm not saying easy, but relatively easier process to build than, say, in the historic district. And yet, you know, we're at 8% IZ, and maybe, you know, under different circumstances, if IZ plus is fully implemented, you get to 10% IZ. It's, you know, pretty hard to get to 20, but it's really difficult, I think, to say, well, you know, if this is the result we're getting today with dense development, dense mixed use development, how do we expect any different result unless we really mix it up and use other ways, whether it's vouchers or direct investment or more stringent requirements? I mean, in Austin, Texas, for example, they, you know, made it possible to increase height and density. But in order to participate, the table stakes is it has to be 50% affordable housing, and it goes up from there. So, you know, DC's requirements are pretty paltry. So, you know,
but again, if it's not being built, like,
Yeah,
it's not there to have any of this apply. So it's been proven that transit-oriented development does increase diversity and opportunity, because you're building around, in this Cleveland Park Metro Rail station is, you know, perfect example of, instead of a housing development there, we have a parking lot that's historic, right? And giving people access to mass transit opportunity allows for more opportunity to get to different jobs around the city and not, you know, have to rely on car, which is expensive, right?
Mhm.
So, and you can always increase service, by the way, on bus lines and metro rail stations that are already built. It's a lot more expensive to start building new ones in different places.
Yeah.
Um,
have
I want to just jump in real quick on
Sure.
to follow up on what Rick was saying. And like, I'm not a historian, I'm also not a housing expert. So I'm going to look to others maybe to fill in here. But and this was one of the points that Mary Che made when she ended up supporting the upflumming of Connecticut Avenue, which was the idea of when new market rate housing does get built, there's a filtering effect that happens that lowers the prices of the older buildings. That the higher income renters or condo buyers are attracted to the new, and that frees up units that are cheaper and lower income for lower income buyers that are in old buildings. I don't know, David or Brian, if you.
I think, Bob, and I want to piggyback on that. I think that's part of it, but it really is, for better or worse, we're in a market economy, and for those developers that are savvy, that are both nonprofit and for-profit, they can do 100% income restricted properties. They're going to have to compete for the market, and that's just it becomes a math problem. But it is a math problem. The district has invested over $1 billion in their housing production trust fund, and $0 of that billion have been spent in Ward 3. And so I think it's kind of all of the above that we've got to do to try and change that history, from the land use changes, from the zoning changes, from getting, I think Rick, somebody mentioned these public sites. There's faith-owned properties, there's public properties that could be used, and they're already off market. And so why not have a request for proposals for these sites to do the income restricted housing like we're talking about? But it's not impossible to get privately owned sites. It's just a recognition that if it is going to have a lot of income restricted units, that whoever that developer is, for-profit, nonprofit, they're going to have to compete with the market, and they're going to need public resources to get there.
Yeah, and to Bob's point, I mean, there could be some filtering going on, and look, I'm not a housing economist, so take this with a grain of salt, but housing markets, as I understand them, are highly localized and segmented. And just as, there could be some shifting, if high market rate buildings are built, where people might move to them and it causes other buildings to become lower priced. And it's possible, at the same time, you can see other impacts, like the example of the building on Connecticut Avenue I spoke of, where through renovation and added infill density, we lose affordable housing units to pick up an unequal number of IZ units. And also, while the comp plan changes do bring some benefits, we have to be mindful that it also can increase economic incentives then for developers to purchase and either tear down or redevelop completely some of those older, buildings, the class C, I guess they'd be called, buildings, in Ward 3 that currently are affordable. So, there may be some filtering, but there may be also, loss of some of those existing more affordable buildings too.
Mhm. We have several questions in the chat that are related to the issue of rent control. One of them, a question for Professor McCabe is, what impact does rent control have on the stability of neighborhoods and the psychological attachment of renters in a neighborhood? And other people, wonder about things like, how use of housing vouchers, and making sure that we're not using them in a way that doesn't benefit the neighborhood, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Ellen, I think the rent control conversation is an interesting one, and it plays nicely off of this conversation about housing filtering, right? Because what we expect to happen in housing markets is that as my income goes up, right, I decide I want a sort of higher quality or more expensive housing unit. And so, as my income goes up, I go and I find a higher quality, more expensive housing unit. And then that unit I was in is now available for somebody who's making less money. And so, most sort of economists would say that rent control disrupts that pattern, right? Because it disincentivizes me from moving because I'm actually not paying for a market rate unit anymore. I'm paying for something that's far below market. And so that sort of disrupts the pattern, right? And so that I think is the tension is on one hand, right? Rent controlled units provide, right, financial stability for renters because they're not tied to income, right? It's not only that low income renters are allowed to have them, it's that anybody that's in that unit that might have been a low income renter when they moved in the 1970s and they're no longer low income. I know I have an uncle who's an example of this, right? Moved into the rent controlled unit that my grandparents had lived in, and for decades has lived in this rent controlled unit, even though he's, he would be able on his income to buy something else. So a lot of housing economists, I think, would say that rent control sort of distorts that filtering, right? That filtering process that sort of naturally happens. On the other hand, I think that advocates for rent control and affordable housing would say, we have so few other options that this is a pretty important option for keeping people's rents reasonable. But I think it goes back sort of to the broader filtering question that we were having, because I think it's important for us to keep in mind that what happens in Cleveland Park is not just about Cleveland Park, right? So what happens in Cleveland Park affects where other people in the city can live as well. I mean, I might be somebody who my preference is to live in Georgetown, right? But I can't afford Georgetown, so I chose Petworth. Somebody else's preference is in Petworth, but I've driven the rents up in Petworth, so they can't afford Petworth, so they're going somewhere else, right? And so that's where the kind of housing, market rate housing, affordable housing question, I think the answer is always like market rate housing and affordable housing. It's not one or the other, right? We want to build market rate housing in Cleveland Park and other neighborhoods, and we want some of that housing to be affordable, right? But if you build more market rate housing, then somebody like me who's slightly priced out of that neighborhood, well, maybe you build more housing in Cleveland Park, sort of rents start to stabilize. I can decide I'm going to live there rather than in Petworth, and that allows sort of rents to stabilize in Petworth and somebody else, right, who would otherwise have chosen a sort of neighborhood down the hierarchy. So I just want to sort of be clear that I think those of us that kind of work in and think about housing, I think we would always say like both and, right? More housing is better because that's going to provide more opportunities for people. That's going to cool off the market of these sort of skyrocketing rental prices. That's going to create more places for people to live. And we want some of that to be affordable because we think it's important that all different kinds of people of different races and economic backgrounds have opportunities to move into different kinds of neighborhoods rather than only being able to choose from neighborhoods east of the river, right? So it's kind of it's like a both and answer, I think.
Definitely. And how does vouchers sort of figure into this discussion? We know that a lot of people are aware of what's happened with the building Sedgwick Gardens, and there were a lot of vouchers units in there, people with vouchers all in one place, and that created some problems in that building. How can we kind of structure the use of vouchers so that kind of thing isn't repeated?
Well, so I mean, I think there are a couple. I'm actually currently working on a book on vouchers, so I could talk your ear off for a long time. I think there are a couple sort of big things to know. I mean, number one is that the voucher program is federally funded, so all the money for housing vouchers actually comes from the federal government. DC has a small kind of like complementary program, but almost all of the vouchers are federally funded. So DC doesn't get enough money to have a voucher for everybody that needs it. And so we have these like extraordinary wait lists. We run lotteries for vouchers. I think it's about 12,000 families in DC that have some sort of voucher. And so an important part about the voucher process is that, number one, only a fraction of people that are eligible actually get those vouchers. And number two, once you have a voucher, you can keep it forever as long as your income doesn't rise above the limits, as long as you don't break the terms of your lease. So a voucher is a sort of lifelong or potentially a lifelong form of rental assistance. But the other thing is there's two kinds of vouchers. So most of the vouchers that we're talking about are called tenant-based vouchers. So we give it to the tenant and they can go find a housing unit anywhere in the city, right? And so as I was talking about earlier, one of the goals of that has to be to kind of educate tenants on the different neighborhoods that are available and sort of let them choose among those neighborhoods. But there are some vouchers that are what we call project-based. So they're stuck to a unit rather than to a tenant. And so that's, I don't know exactly sort of where in the cities these are, but when you get a lot of vouchers sort of concentrated in a building, either that's because a developer had project-based vouchers, so those vouchers are tied to a building, or because a lot of tenants with vouchers ended up wanting to live in that particular building. But in large part, just because of the neighborhoods where voucher holders are coming from, right, largely low income Black neighborhoods east of the river, largely because landlords that are willing to accept them, right, landlords in neighborhoods in Ward 7 and Ward 8 are much more likely to accept vouchers than landlords in Ward 3. That's just, that's just the reality of it. So there are a lot of pieces. Part of it is advocating for more funding. Part of it is possibly DC expanding its own voucher program to get more families on vouchers through DC's local program. Part of it is like continued training with both landlords and with tenants to think about the neighborhoods and think about anti-discrimination practices. But anyways, I think vouchers is a big piece of this puzzle.
Great. And, we have a couple of questions too that are sort of related to the idea of, is there any movement or any consideration, or, do we want to consider the idea of, shrinking what we think about in terms of historic district or historic preservation and making it only really the iconic buildings like the Uptown Theater or the Firehouse, but not necessarily this idea of a historic neighborhood? And do other cities, do this kind of thing that, DC does, where we freeze, entire neighborhoods, in certain ways, rather than just landmarking, individual buildings?
Well, first of all, and I'll let others chime in, I would disagree with the premise that we're freezing entire neighborhoods, because, as I pointed out earlier, first of all sorts of changes, whether it's the single family houses or duplexes or auxiliary dwelling units, or for that matter, multifamily infill, development buildings in Cleveland Park, have occurred and are ongoing in the historic district. I'm not aware, though others may be, of where historic districts have been, rolled back or curtailed. I mean, the importance of an historic district is that it recognizes, the architectural cohesion of a neighborhood. And, in Cleveland Park, we have not only, a variety of architecture, but also, similar architecture that was built around the same time. We also have the most intact assemblage of Art Deco structures in the entire city, including the Uptown. So these are things that, that's why we have the historic district and not just individual isolated landmark properties, although there are some of those too. The movement to sort of rethink and sunset or roll back historic districts, interestingly enough, started in the Midwest, some years back, is really an idea by, more conservative, libertarian, property focused, advocacy groups that saw it as an infringement on property rights. And, then later there developed this notion, that has been explored today, whether, historic districts, are antithetical to affordable housing, but I would submit, and the research submits, that, that they can be symbiotic things, that historic preservation does, it's a needed tool for affordable housing. And, and I finally just want to stress, if I didn't at the beginning, I mean, CPHS supports affordable housing. We support, new and deeply affordable housing in this neighborhood, as we support, and in the historic district, as we support infill that is, as I said, compatible with the historic context. And we especially, or I should say, we additionally support, preservation of existing affordable housing stock. So, I think there can't be, debate about the goal. In my view, I think DC needs to be more creative and more active and double down on ways to achieve true affordability.
Great.
Can I just check in real quick with everybody? We're past time, but I want to make sure that, I don't want to, if people have, the panelists can spend a few more minutes, because we do have some more questions, or taking a temperature check here.
I think we're fine.
Sure.
Sounds good.
So I just wanted to follow up
Yeah,
on the question and what Rick said, and then maybe ask Brian on this. One of the things that I think makes DC's historic preservation unique, or if not unique, certainly different than, say, New York, is that there is intended in the system a balancing of priorities, where the default is that preservation is the dominant priority. Buildings are reviewed, designed, approved, not approved, modified. But in cases of where there are competing policy priorities, you can have cases of special merit where there's a hearing held and there's a balancing test that's done. So I don't know, Brian, if you want to, you might know something about this. I'm not sure. Is that something that's available as we go? For example, if we're going into a planning process, specifically on the commercial area on Cleveland Park and Woodley Park, and there's going to be a tension between how much housing can be built there, that the council has allowed, and rezoning to happen. But so that would be an upward tension, and then the downward tension is we've got a low scale commercial area, and there's going to be calls to keep it low scale. If, for example, during that process, we want to prioritize affordability, maybe we can say that these would be projects of special merit that should weigh down the historic preservation height limit, or however it would be imposed, not to minimize the design or architectural detail, but massing height, that you could build more up to what the density is allowed, if it had these affordable housing or whatever the priorities the planning process deems.
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing that I was thinking about, and I think this is related to what you're asking, is, depending on what city you're in, the restrictions in a historic district are different, right? And my understanding is that there's an interesting trade-off in DC, and maybe Rick, I can punt this to you, probably know better, but I think that in DC, it's something like 20% of properties are covered by a historic district. I just pulled up the. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot relative to other cities. Like when we did work on New York, only 3% of properties in New York are covered by a historic district. Now, there's a ton of variation across the city, right? In Manhattan, there's a lot more, and in Staten Island, there's a lot less. But the share of properties that are covered in a historic district is much higher in DC. But my understanding also, and I appreciate other expertise on this, is that there's actually quite a bit more room for development in a historic district in DC than there is in New York. So in New York, like it's very untouchable, right? Almost nothing happens in historic districts, whereas in DC, I believe there's more room for development. So a bit of a kind of trade-off there, right? A lot more regulated by historic districts, but also a lot more wiggle room within them.
Great.
My understanding is that's generally correct, and in addition to the mayor's agent process that, Bob Ward outlined, which, was used most recently for the reconstruction of a local elementary school.
Cool. Well, we have, Bob.
Just to follow up on what Brian said. So there's redistricting software out there that the Office of Planning has, and you can like assemble different census blocks in the city and get demographic counts from it. And so I totally wasted an afternoon doing that, forming up the historic districts in DC. 22% of DC's population lives in a historic district. And that's a lot, right? More than 1 out of 5 people live in a historic district. They are overwhelmingly white, by like a 6-to-1 margin, and obviously the 80 whatever percent or 70-something% that are not in the historic district are overwhelmingly not white. So yeah, I think that's something that the Office of Planning and the Historic Preservation Office should do. I think what Brian was talking about, assessing what kind of housing can't be built. What are the costs? I mean, we know what the benefits of historic preservation is. It's why we live here. It's wonderful, but we don't measure the costs, and there are costs, and that should be something our historic preservation office measures. That should be part of the historic preservation plan. And when projects come in, it should be recognized of what's happening. So the example that Janelle mentioned, when they couldn't build above 3412 Connecticut, where the old 4Ps building, because it would block the view of the Macklin apartment building, there was a cost there, right? There was housing that could have gone there that wasn't, specifically because of historic preservation. We don't measure any of that. We should.
Definitely.
There's also a cost to the people who don't currently have house, right? Like that is a cost to their lives. And there's also, with the historic district not, getting rid of it, but I'm hoping these design guidelines like further define and outline, especially HPRB becomes exceedingly broad in their definition of what is considered historic and not at times. So hopefully this brings some sort of streamlining and more definition to that, so that is more clear, and these projects can come up to these reviews like not being surprised by somebody's opinion or mood of that day, right? So
Great. Well, since Dave, does somebody else have another remark?
I was just going to say something to follow on Professor McCabe. I mean, he's actually done some, interesting research in New York as well that, I think does suggest, and this is borne out maybe in the DC data, that, historic districts have been associated more with resourced neighborhoods and, have even been seen as elite driven. I think that, that's changing. In fact, a really inspiring example of broadening historic preservation, not only geographically, but beyond, what I think has been a materially based policy is, the listing of Bloomingdale a couple of or 3 years ago as one of the newer historic districts, not only for its cohesive row house architecture, but also, and is kind of a good way to tie together its prominent role in the struggle to abolish racially restrictive housing covenants in the district and in the nation. And, maybe this won't be greeted unequivocally as good news by everybody on this call, but, recognizing that, some parts of the city struggle more to document their history and preserve, the fabric of community. I mean, our board a couple of years ago, determined to start a grant program, a matching grant program that would provide seed money, for less advantaged, groups in less advantaged areas to document their own history. So, I think that the racial composition of historic districts is changing. Fortunately, there are more efforts to document history changing, but of course, those also present other complications as we've discussed tonight.
Great. Well, we don't have we're out of time, as Bob mentioned. I know we have a few more questions that we weren't able to get to, but I think actually a lot of them might be more appropriate for our second presentation. So I encourage people who didn't get their questions answered to, please attend our second presentation. I think that, we can have a deeper discussion about the kinds of topics that people were wanting to get into, in that presentation as well. And you can also, send us your questions, before the presentation, or, if you somehow can't attend our next presentation, that's going to be in February. And I'm going to turn it over to David to say a little bit about that.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, and thanks to everybody who showed up tonight. It was really a lot of participation, almost 120 people that we saw that signed in. So that's really great. It shows there's a lot of interest in this particular topic. And as Ellen said, this is the first of 3 seminars. The second one's going to focus really on the need and sort of how to, what that looks like in terms of numbers. And we've seen some numbers already in terms of rents and housing prices, in terms of supply, but also the faces of what that need is. I mean, who are the people that are would be looking for these homes and these apartments, these co-ops and condos, if they were available. So that's going to be the focus of the second session. I'm also suspicious, and not in a bad way, but a good way, but we've also kind of talked about some of the potential solutions in terms of what does this supply look like? How do we get there? And so I think the next conversation will probably bleed into that a little bit more than we anticipated, but I think it's a good thing because then it sets us up for the third session in March, which is really to hone in and focus on that, really what are the concrete things that we can do to expand affordability and diversity and more housing here in Cleveland Park and nearby. So that session is going to be Thursday, February 17th at 7:30. Everybody will sign up tonight, I believe, Bob. We'll get an invitation. As Ellen said, send us your questions, and we look forward to having you in a month. I want to thank the panelists. Thanks to Bob, who was the main organizer on this. Thanks to Brian. It's great information and great kind of a step back, and the research you're doing is amazing. And we certainly want to hook up the person that the person we're looking at for the second session with you to kind of share some information. I think it'll be great. Thanks to Rick from the association. It was really good to have you with us and have your perspective, and it's really helpful. Janelle and Ellen, you as well. So if there's nothing else, have a good night. Stay safe, and we will see you 4 weeks from tonight, hopefully. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.